Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the new Sony a6400 APS-C mirrorless camera. Now, as you can see behind me, we have managed to have yet another snowstorm, and here we are. This is April 1st, and no April Fool's Day. I have as much snow pretty much as what I have had all winter, which is now going on for 6 months. So on a positive news, I'm able to report to you that I have had zero overheating issues with the a6400 when shooting 4K video, because we have been in perpetual winter like Narnia, where Christmas never comes. Other people have reported in warmer places, however, that they have also had zero issues with overheating. And so that is but one example of ways that Sony has continued to evolve the A6 series and help to improve its performance, helping the a6400 to round into a fairly complete camera, however, with a few exceptions that I will highlight here today. In my first look episode, which I would encourage you to take a look at, because for the sake of time, I need to just kind of hit the highlights in the final verdict here. So if you want more details, you need to watch the subsequent episodes. And so that first look handling episode, I detailed some areas where the a6400 is similar to the a6300 or the a6500, and where it deviates from those cameras. But a few things that I will just note from that is, number one, I do need to issue a retraction, a mistake on my part. I reported in that first look episode that there was a different design to the actual eye cup of the viewfinder. It turns out, however, that the eye cup for it was hidden down in the box, and I had never seen it. And so actually the eye cup design is identical to that of the a6500. So, I mean, good news for, I guess, in the sense of comfort, and so please disregard my formal remark on that. However, that does raise one other minor issue, and that is that when using the larger eye cup, while you do now have a selfie mode that, while on the a6500, the screen can only go up to a little past 90 degrees, rotating up. In this case, obviously, you can rotate a full 180 degrees. You can now have a front-facing screen. But including the full eye cup does obscure a small portion of the screen here. And of course that highlights the bigger issue in that the hot shoe is located right here. And so if you actually have a microphone, for example, you're wanting to do vlogging, you have a microphone or some other accessory mounted on the hot shoe, it means that the forward-facing screen becomes far less useful, because a good part of it is going to be blocked by the obstruction of something mounted to the hot shoe. So it's a welcome improvement, don't get me wrong, but I would say that it's probably still not as useful for that reason as, say, Canon's design, where they have an articulating screen that comes out to the side, to where there's less chance of it being obstructed by something that's mounted on the top assembly. Also in that episode, I noted that there were a few other minor handling issues. There's a little bit of different reconfiguration on the mode dial. Rather than having a couple of custom modes there, they have moved, slow and quick video type modes on there. They have also added one MR, or memory recall position, which seems to function pretty much like a custom button does, but for whatever reason they elected to rename it. Or custom mode, I should say, not button. There is also one less custom button on the camera, and so rather than there being the two C2 and C1 buttons that are on the top of the a6500, there is one C1 button that is actually right next to the shutter button, and that's possible because the grip itself has been widened a little bit, and that is a positive improvement. It makes for, the dimensions are almost identical of the a6300, a6500, and a6400, with the exception that it is a little bit thicker a camera, and that comes down to this expanded grip. But it is a positive improvement that while the grip, the width of the camera overall is not big enough for those of us with, bigger hands. But the positive thing is that as far as actually gripping the camera, I feel like I'm actually gripping, as opposed to with the case of the a6500 or a6300, it feels a little bit more like you're pinching the camera if you have bigger hands. And so an improvement there, and of course using some kind of grip extender bigger. On the a6500, I used the small rig, grip extender and L bracket. It does help to make that, give you a little bit more room to put that pinky finger if you have larger hands. But that is, I would say, the largest physical improvement. What's not really all that improved here, unfortunately, is the touchscreen. And unfortunately, Sony continues to lag behind, particularly Canon, but also to a lesser extent, even Nikon and Fuji when it comes to the implementation of the touchscreen. The good news is that now you can actually program the touchscreen to do things like touch to activate shutter or touch to track. The only problem is that to get to those settings, they're fairly deeply buried in the menu system, and so you have to really look for it to find it. It's not available like either through a quick menu. So it may be something you might want to map to a button, and at the very least, on a positive note, they do now have the My Menu settings like the A7 series, and so you can program some of these hidden functions that kind of get lost there into a My Menu and make them a little bit more easy to access. So, I mean, there are a few improvements there, but there's still zero navigation, even if you're using the FN or quick menu. There's no, touching to reach any kind of mode, and so you are still limited behind what other people are doing. And honestly, I don't know why that's the case. I mean, you can also use the touchscreen. If you're looking through the viewfinder, you can move your Flexi AF point around, which is very, very useful. And that's arguably much more useful than using a joystick to accomplish that. But why Sony hasn't been able to fully implement menu navigation and, a little more responsive a touchscreen, I don't know, but it's not there yet, unfortunately. And so, kind of a few minor evolutionary steps, but nothing that's revolutionary as far as the touchscreen goes. My other kind of quibble here is that I've never been a fan of the actual memory card placement, and you still have a single memory card slot, and people will make a big deal out of that. But remember too, we're talking about a sub $1,000 camera, and there aren't many sub $1,000 cameras that have dual card slots. And in fact, we just, not long ago, I reviewed the Canon EOS R, which is a $2,000+ camera, and it only has a single card slot. So I'm making less of a big deal out of that, but I really do hate the memory card placement. I find it's not easy to access and get at. It's, once you've initially popped into release, there's not a lot of room to reach in there and pinch the memory card. And that gets worse if you add a grip extender or an L bracket or something, because then you're reaching in even deeper. And if with an L bracket in place, I find that I actually often have to remove the battery to allow a little bit more room to navigate to get at the memory card. And so I would vastly prefer a side-mounted memory card slot like most other cameras have. And so unfortunately that hasn't changed, nor has the MPFW50 battery, which has been the standard for the A6 series for a while. And it's, particularly when you're shooting 4K, it's a little bit better than what it's been in previous implementations. A6500 I find really burns through batteries. A6400 is a little bit better. They've obviously improved some of the power draw, power consumption, but it's still not fantastic. And so I wouldn't mind if we see an A6500 replacement, which I think will happen. What seems to have happened is that the A6400, as the naming scheme suggests, it's not a number progressed beyond A6500. So I suspect that what Sony is doing is perhaps diversifying this A6000 series, going into a mass market, which the A6400 will be, not having in-body image stabilization, having a reduced buffer rate, which is also true in the A6400. And so just to give you an idea of that, so it doesn't have the in-body image stabilization, A6500 does, and it also has a buffer of 46 RAW files compared to 107 RAW files on the A6500, or 116 JPEGs compared to 233 in the Sony, or in the A6500, I should say. And so I think that they are kind of maybe splitting off these lines, and so we might see a little bit more of a sports-oriented body that replaces the A6500. You know, maybe they may even move it upscale in terms of price. I don't know that. I would really love to see them with the A6500 replacement go to a more robust body and a more robust battery, have the in-body and stabilization, maybe even jack up that burst rate a little bit higher, a little bit deeper buffer, but already this is extraordinarily competitive. And I will note that while it's a, you know, kind of a step down from the A6500 in that regard, the A6400 compared to market competitors actually still has very good buffer stats. And one other improvement that I will point to when it comes to that frame rate is that while there's no improvement in the frame rate in mechanical shutter mode over the A6500, the A6400 does improve when it comes to the silent shutter. And whereas you dropped from 11 frames per second mechanical shutter on the A6500 to a very slow, by comparison, 3 frames per second burst in silent mode, you now retain a fairly robust 8 frames per second in silent mode, which is obviously much, much more useful. There's a few things that do help video, although our basic codecs, our basic frame rates, our basic structure, none of that is really changed. And so with 4K, you're still capped off at 30 frames per second. You basically have a 24, 25, and 29, 30 frame per second options when it comes to 4K. 1080, you can get as high as 120 frames per second, obviously very useful, but no forward momentum or forward progress in any of these areas. So if you were looking for a 60 frames per second in 4K, that has not yet arrived on a Sony camera like this. But a few things that are, you know, more subtle things that are there. We've already noted that they've continued to improve the heat dissipation, and so people are not reporting running into the overheat issues. And after a couple of years of use with the A6500, I did employ the setting that allowed the temperature to go up into a higher zone before the camera shuts down. But I've actually only seen it overheat a couple of times, and that was because I was filming where direct sunlight was on the camera itself and causing it to overheat. So, I mean, further progress there. Another bit of progress is that quietly Sony has eliminated the 29-minute, 59-second recording limit. And so you can actually do long format recording now, video recording, which is certainly progress on that front. The other thing that they have added in is an HLG profile, which is a hybrid log profile. And what that will allow you to do is to get footage that is better suited for editing, high dynamic range, and also better for display for that. And so, you know, little things, but certainly valuable things. Kind of the main feature upgrade, I mean, the marketing is the selfie mode, but we've already noted that comes with some drawbacks. But what the real headline here should be is a further progression when it comes to the actual focus system that is here. And it's not only an upgrade for the A6 series in terms of focus, but it's the first time they're rolling out something called real-time IAF and real-time tracking, which actually is something that was out ahead of the A9 and the A7 series, and the A9 has just received a firmware update to receive the same functionality. A7 series, sometime in the month of April 2019, it's supposed to receive a firmware update to address that. But basically what it does is that wherein in times past, say on the A6500, it does have IAF, and you know, I've got the new Sigma 56mm f1.4 DCDN lens here. And so, you know, obviously IAF and a portrait-oriented lens is awesome. But what's been there before is that you would have to employ a button press, something other than the shutter, to activate IAF. And so in other words, it wasn't always active. What happens now with A6400 with the real-time IAF is that as soon as you press the shutter halfway down, IAF and real-time tracking is already active. It is, unless you physically turn it off in the menu, it is already active, and it works really seamlessly well. It makes this a very good portrait camera, you know, paired with a lens like that Sigma, because the IAF works super well, and it's much easier to activate. The problem, it's not so bad on the A7 series for the simple reason that you have a bigger body to work with and you've got more customizable buttons and functions. And so I didn't find it as hard to map something to activate IAF. In the case of the A6500 or the A6 series bodies, there's less real estate, there's less customizable buttons. And as a byproduct, I was using in the past, I was having to use the center button, kind of the enter button in the D-pad, rear wheel. And so, and as far as the ergonomics of activating that, it wasn't ideal. The fact that you can now do that with just a half shutter press is obviously much more ergonomically pleasing. Thus, it makes the use of IAF much better. That also, of course, translates into the real-time tracking. Also translates into your video tracking, which has kind of set the bar higher still for Sony when it comes to that. And so it's IAF, it's face tracking, all of those things are much improved, and thus you're getting a really, really competitive system that I think finally is catching up to what Canon has had with the DPAF. And so good things happening there. Also beyond that, the actual focus system itself has been made more robust. Whereas they already had in this series, you already had 425 phase detect AF points. But what is improved here is that previously the A6300/A6500 had 169 contrast AF points. And so, it's a fairly good sized block, but located more towards the center. Now what you have got is the full 425 contrast AF point array as well. And so you basically have identical coverage across the whole sensor, the whole frame. And so wherever you decide to focus, you have got, that hybrid AF happening. It's going to deliver the best kinds of results. So obviously when you comes to tracking, be it tracking for photography or tracking for video, there's been a real amount of progress when it comes to that. Another welcome change is that they have implemented and kind of killed off the App Store, which they did that in the A7 series, which we kind of criticized them for that. Not because many people love the App Store. I felt it was a very, very clunky implementation. It didn't work very well. So they killed it off the A7 series. However, they eliminated the means of having an intervalometer to shoot like time lapses, unless you're using some kind of external device. And so they eliminated an option for doing that without replacing it. Fortunately, they have begun the rollout here with the A6400 where there is a fully fleshed out intervalometer functionality, other than the fact that I haven't seen a means at this point to create time-lapse movies in camera. And so you have to do it right now, as far as I can tell, in software in post. So, I mean, that's a drawback, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that addressed through firmware update. The good news, again, also with the A9 series and the A7 series is that they, through firmware, are adding this functionality back in. And so kudos to Sony. One of my, criticisms with Sony in the past is that they are so forward-thinking. They're a very innovative company, but sometimes they do that to the detriment of servicing their legacy products. They're so much thinking about the next big thing that they tend to orphan existing products. And so I do want to give a shout out to Sony for not doing that with the A9 and the A7 series, but continuing to add this functionality to make better cameras through firmware. So thank you for that. But again, this inexpensive A6400 is actually the pilot for a fair bit of new Sony technology. So a lot of good things going on there. Now, as far as the sensor itself, in a secondary episode, I did compare the sensor performance from the A6400 and the A6500. Now, obviously, we're working with the same basic sensor here. It is a 24 megapixel. It's got that same Bion X processor that's a part of it. And so we're working with the same basic sensor, but Sony has done some tweaks to it, changed a little bit of the way that it processes and handles information, some tweaks to the color science. I noted some difference in the way that the two cameras meter. I wouldn't say that I thought that the A6400 did a better job. I actually felt like it did a little bit worse job in my test, but certainly there are some tweaks that happened there. The other thing that has been tweaked is that Sony has felt the confidence, at least for marketing purposes, to up the native ISO range up to ISO 33,000 rather than capping it off at 25,600. So I would recommend that you look at that video episode to get the full details on sensor performance, and I'll just skim a couple of the highlights here. And so what I did note is that there is some subtle differences in the way that they handle information. And so some better and some worse in my estimation. You know, you tweak with the formula, you make some improvements, you don't always make consistent improvements. The main improvements that I did see is that at certain ISO levels, particularly the kind of the mid levels of ISO, you know, I noticed that the A6500 began to lose a little bit of contrast and detail. You know, very, very subtle amounts. You probably wouldn't notice if you didn't have the images side by side, but I did find that the A6400 under identical settings was a hair bit better on that, and maybe a hair bit even in that metric as you pushed on up into the higher ISO range. What I also noted is that while at base, you know, I shouldn't say base ISO, but rather just a kind of a properly exposed ISO, even at upper ISO limits, I didn't feel like the basic image was really much better with the A6400. In some cases, I actually felt like the A6500 had a little bit less of a green cast in certain areas of the frame in my test. But what I did notice is that when I pushed, and when I say push, I'm either talking about either pulling down highlights or raising up shadows. And so when it came to pulling down highlights, I felt like the cameras behaved almost identically. But when pushing shadows, which is something that you do fairly frequently, I definitely felt like the A6400 behaved better. That was kind of the standout to me when comparing the sensors, in that I found that the A6400 or A6500 image, I should say, it lost a little bit of contrast when pushing those shadows. Also, I felt like it introduced more of a green cast and recovering that. And ironically, since I saw a little bit less of the green cast in just straight images, with the A6400, it actually stayed more neutral when the images were pushed and those shadows were raised. And so it retained better contrast. It also retained a little bit better color fidelity. And so I would say sum total of that is that there are some improvements. They may not be significant enough for you to tell the difference unless you were really, really tuned in to the performance of an A6300 or an A6500. At the upper end at ISO, although you have to go into the expanded ISO range to get to 33,000 in the A6500, frankly, I did not see hardly any difference with them side by side, even though you're in the native ISO range. It's not a bad performance. And I think the takeaway from this is not that Sony hasn't improved. It's that Sony already essentially had what may be the best APS-C sensor in some of these metrics, certainly in dynamic range. It's been the highest rated sensor for a few years for APS-C cameras. And so they already had a really, really good thing. And kind of like what Sony did with the A7 third generation series compared to the A7 second generation series, they really tweaked more of the other areas and didn't do a whole lot with the sensor. And that's basically what's happened here as well. There are some tweaks to it, but don't buy the A6400 expecting there to be significant improvements to any of those metrics, even ISO, even though they will tout the ISO range goes up higher. That's really not the reason to buy this camera. There are some reasons to buy this camera. Obviously, the improved autofocus is a big deal. The real-time IAF and tracking is a big deal. You know, maybe the selfie mode screen may be a big deal for you. There are definitely some solid things here. And it's worth noting, as we draw to a conclusion, that what Sony has done is that they have loaded more functionality in this camera, and it's actually coming to market for $100 cheaper than what the A6300 did 3 years ago in 2016. And so I do think that you're getting a fairly strong value in the A6400. I think the biggest determination right now as to whether or not you should buy an A6400 or buy an A6500 really comes down to how important having in-body image stabilization, steady shot is to you. Now, obviously, there are some lenses that have an optical steady shot, OSS, built into them, but, you know, those lenses are not consistent. With the A6500, whatever lens you happen to be mounted on there, you will have some image stabilization, and allowing Sony to sell the A6400 at a very competitive price point. And it is that. at $899 in the US market for the body alone. And if you don't have a general purpose lens, while I've got here with the kit with the 16 to 50 millimeter OSS lens. This is not a world beater of a lens. It's a little bit of a quirky lens with a power zoom and whatever. It's not the world's best lens, but it's also not terrible. And while it retails separately for 300 bucks, in the kit with the a6400, you can get it for only 100 bucks more. So instead of $899, you can get it for $999 with the lens. And because the lens does retract so much and is so nicely compact, it's not a bad lens to have, even as just one to throw into the bag in case while you're going to shoot, maybe you're going out with a telephoto, but or something with a narrower angle of view, just to have that option. The fact that it does go to 16 millimeters, or a 24 millimeter full frame equivalent is useful. And so maybe something to consider there on that front. I'll throw a linkage in the description down below, and so you can access both of those things. In terms of the focus difference between the two, it really depends on where you're focusing. Remember that the focus system here outside of the real-time IAF, in a pretty good chunk of the center of the frame, the two cameras have identical coverage. It's more out on the periphery of the frame, and so if you're tracking something all across the frame, a6400 is going to give you a better performance. It's better to have the more robust AF system, but I do want to make the point if you're kind of saying, well, I really need the in-body image stabilization, but I need the better focus. The focus is better, but it's not to say that the focus in the a6500 is bad, because that's anything but true. And so, maybe some things to help you to consider on that. If you look in the description down below, I also have a full text review that may help to answer a few more questions I've not covered in this. I encourage you to watch those other video episodes to get my kind of full take on everything here with the a6400. There is also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And if you are looking for, haven't released the review yet, but if you're looking for a nice portrait lens for this kit, this new Sigma 56mm f1.4 is pretty much a treat when it comes to that. Beyond that, you can also find linkage to follow me on social media, including now on Instagram. You can find linkage there to become a patron and to not only support this channel, but also get sneak previews of upcoming content before anyone else does. And finally, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.